Two American families got the knock on the door this weekend that every military family dreads. A third family is still waiting for an answer nobody wants to give them. And within hours of that news reaching Washington, American aircraft were already airborne over Iran, carrying out the 8th consecutive night of strikes in this stretch of the war, this time with a mission statement CENTCOM had never used before in this entire conflict. Not just degrade, punish. Before we get into what that shift in language actually means operationally, you need to understand exactly what happened in Jordan, because this is the moment this war stopped being an abstraction for a lot of people who had been watching it from a distance. And it is worth slowing down and getting the details right rather than rushing past them toward the next strike video, because the people at the center of this particular story will never get to rush past what happened to them. Let's back all the way up, because the sequence matters. On the night of July 17th, Iranian ballistic missiles struck Muwaffaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility that hosts American troops and fighter jets and that has absorbed repeated Iranian attacks throughout this war, having been targeted on multiple prior occasions during earlier rounds of Iranian retaliation against American and Allied positions in the region. Each of those earlier strikes intercepted by a combination of Jordanian and American air defenses without producing the kind of casualties this latest attack ultimately did. CENTCOM confirmed that 2 American service members were killed in action as U.S. and partner forces defended against the Iranian ballistic missile and drone attack, with a 3rd service member reported missing. 4 additional Americans were medically evacuated to hospitals in Jordan but have since been discharged, and other personnel who sustained minor injuries have returned to duty. CENTCOM said it would withhold the identities of the 2 fallen service members until 24 hours after their families had been notified. Standard protocol, but a detail that underscores how fresh and raw this loss still is as this update goes out. It is a reminder easy to lose amid strike footage and strategic analysis that behind every statistic in this war sits a specific person, a specific family, and a specific community that will carry this loss long after this particular news cycle has moved on to whatever comes next. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed responsibility for the strike in a statement issued Saturday, saying it had targeted a base used by American forces in Al-Azraq, Jordan, and claiming to have completely destroyed several aircraft in an attack it said was carried out with both missiles and drones, a claim released to Iranian state media within hours of the attack itself, well before any independent assessment of the actual damage could plausibly have been completed. That claim of destroyed aircraft has not been independently corroborated and fits the now well-established pattern throughout this war of Iranian damage claims, running consistently ahead of what CENTCOM or independent observers have been able to verify, a pattern worth remembering any time Tehran's own statements are the only source available for a given claim. President Trump asked about the deaths, called it a very sad thing, saying the United States hates to see it happen, that it happened in service to the country, and separately describing the losses as the ultimate price and the ultimate sacrifice paid to help prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's public statement was shorter and sharper. Godspeed, heroes, their sacrifice only stiffens our resolve. These 2 deaths bring the confirmed American toll in this war to a range that different outlets have reported slightly differently as the count continues to be updated in real time, with figures ranging from 14 to 16 service members killed depending on when exactly each report was filed, plus at least 1 additional death reported separately in Iraq around the same period. The bulk of that earlier toll traces back to March 1st, when 6 U.S. Army Reserve soldiers were killed by a direct Iranian strike on a makeshift operations center at Kuwait's Shuaiba port, the single deadliest incident for American forces in this war up to that point, an attack that came after a projectile penetrated what officials at the time described as a fortified operations center, striking home the reality that even hardened, well-defended American positions in this theater have not proven immune to Iranian ballistic and drone attacks over the full course of this conflict. Separate reporting has indicated an additional American service member died in Iraq during the same general period, a detail that, if it holds up under further reporting, would push the cumulative toll for this war higher still, and would suggest the risk to American personnel is no longer confined to the handful of countries that have absorbed the most visible waves of Iranian missile and drone fire, extending instead into a wider footprint of American positions across the region. Whatever the precise, fully reconciled final number turns out to be, once all the reporting settles, the trend line is unambiguous. This is now a war that is regularly, repeatedly killing American service members, not an air campaign being fought at 0 cost to the people carrying it out, and the roughly 5-month arc from that first mass casualty incident in Kuwait to this latest pair of losses in Jordan traces a war that has never gone more than a handful of weeks at a time without American forces themselves coming under direct lethal fire. The State Department responded by issuing a worldwide caution alert to American citizens, the first alert of that scope since the opening weeks of this war back in February. That is a meaningful signal on its own terms. A worldwide caution alert is not issued lightly or reflexively. It represents the State Department's own assessment that the risk environment for Americans abroad, not just in the immediate conflict zone but globally, has shifted meaningfully enough to warrant a blanket advisory rather than a narrower, regionally specific one. Returning to that same alert level suggests officials view the killing of American troops in Jordan as a genuine inflection point in the broader risk picture of this war, not simply another exchange of fire in an ongoing pattern. And it signals to American citizens and businesses operating anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East, that the potential for retaliatory action connected to this conflict is now judged to extend well beyond the immediate theater of operations. Now let's talk about how CENTCOM actually responded, because the language used in the retaliatory strike statement represents a real and deliberate departure from everything said in the 7 nights of strikes that came before it. CENTCOM confirmed it launched a new round of strikes against Iran around 6 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. And this time, the stated purpose included something new. The strikes are designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and swiftly punish Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces, who launched attacks against American service members in Jordan. Swiftly punish. That is the first time in 8 consecutive nights of this campaign that CENTCOM has explicitly named the IRGC itself by name as the direct target of retaliatory action, rather than describing strikes in the more general language of degrading capabilities or protecting shipping, and the speed with which that language shift followed the Jordan deaths within a single day tells you something about how directly this specific retaliatory wave was tied to those 2 specific losses, rather than simply representing the next scheduled increment in an already ongoing campaign. Read that shift carefully, because the distinction between degrading capability and swiftly punishing a specific organization for a specific act is not a small rhetorical difference. It reframes this particular round of strikes from a continuation of the broader campaign into something closer to a direct, named response to American deaths, and it does so within roughly 24 hours of the attack that caused them. A turnaround is fast enough that it leaves little doubt about the causal link between the 2 events, even though CENTCOM's own public language has been careful to frame the strikes as serving the dual purpose of both punishment and continued degradation of Iran's broader maritime threat capability, rather than retaliation alone. The strikes themselves, based on footage CENTCOM released around 9:30 p.m. Eastern the same night, focused heavily on what appeared to be deeply buried ballistic missile infrastructure in IRGC headquarters facilities, alongside the coastal surveillance, air defense, and maritime capability targets that had featured in every previous night of this campaign. Some of the explosions visible in that footage were among the largest recorded in this entire stretch of the war, consistent with the use of bunker-penetrating munitions against hardened, deeply buried facilities, rather than the more exposed coastal infrastructure targeted earlier in the campaign, a detail that fits the broader pattern of this war, where each new phase of retaliation has tended to reach deeper and more directly into Iran's command structure than the phase before it. Now let's talk about the platforms potentially involved in this specific round, because there is a genuinely interesting operational picture here. Even though key details remain officially unconfirmed, multiple signs point toward the possible reintroduction of the B-52 Stratofortress into this campaign, though CENTCOM has not officially confirmed its use in these specific strikes. Observed activity around Royal Air Force Fairford in England, a base with a long history of hosting B-52 deployments during past American military campaigns, along with senior administration advisors, posting footage on social media showing a B-52 flying in formation with F-22 fighters, has fueled speculation that the aircraft may be flying missions connected to this war. If that speculation holds up, the aircraft brings a genuinely formidable capability to this specific fight. The B-52H model, in continuous service since 1961, predates the IRGC itself by nearly 2 decades, and has been so extensively modernized across its decades of service that the airframe is essentially the only original component remaining on a modern H model. It can carry up to 20 AGM-86B air-launched cruise missiles externally in addition to its internal weapons load, or the Extended Range Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, a weapon with a stated range exceeding 500 nautical miles, and a low radar cross-section that navigates autonomously after release. That combination lets the aircraft launch from well outside the range of any Iranian air defenses that remain functional after 8 nights of strikes, releasing cruise missiles that then approach their targets at low altitude along terrain-hugging routes, arriving from multiple directions, simultaneously in a way that Iran's air defense network, built to track individual aircraft, rather than dozens of simultaneously inbound cruise missiles, was never designed to handle at scale. Alongside a possible B-52 presence, the campaign has continued to rely on the EA-18G Growler for electronic warfare, an aircraft built specifically to blind an adversary's air defense network before anything else in a strike package arrives. The Growler carries a jamming system capable of overwhelming enemy radar with electronic noise, alongside anti-radiation missiles that home in on radar emissions and can permanently take a site off the air, whether through jamming or physical destruction. In practice, the aircraft often does both simultaneously against multiple emitters at once, degrading Iran's overall radar picture into what amounts to static by the time the rest of the strike package actually arrives over target. The F-16, in its Block 50 and Block 52 variants, has functioned throughout this campaign as the precision delivery workhorse. An airframe that has now been in frontline combat service for roughly 3 decades, longer than many of the Iranian air defense operators currently attempting to counter it have been alive, capable of putting guided munitions on point targets identified by intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets hours in advance, through a specific window in a specific building, in poor weather, against a target the pilot may not have seen until stepping out to the aircraft itself. And the carrier strike group operating in the region has continued to contribute Tomahawk cruise missile strikes against Iranian coastal and inland targets throughout this stretch of the war, providing yet another simultaneous vector of attack alongside whatever aircraft are operating overhead, a fourth distinct strike vector layered on top of the electronic warfare, precision strike, and standoff bomber elements already described. There is also a specific logistics signal worth noting, because it may indicate how far this campaign is prepared to expand. The United States has repositioned additional aerial refueling tankers from Ben Gurion Airport to Israeli military bases deeper inside the region. Aerial refueling capacity is, in a very real sense, the invisible constraint on how far and how sustained any air campaign can actually be. Strike aircraft, without refueling support, have a fixed operational range and a fixed number of sorties they can fly before needing to return to a forward base. Moving tankers closer to the theater extends that ceiling substantially, and it matters specifically for a platform like the B-2 Spirit, a stealth bomber capable of flying a mission directly from the continental United States, striking a target anywhere on Earth and returning home, but only with the kind of extended refueling support that repositioned tankers would provide. Trump has separately and repeatedly referenced Pickaxe Mountain, an underground site suspected of supporting Iran's nuclear program, as a target primed and ready to be struck if deemed necessary. Whether repositioning tankers closer to the theater is specifically preparatory to a B-2 strike against that target, or simply reflects the broader logistics needs of a campaign now in its second week of nightly operations, is not something that can be determined with certainty from the outside, but the timing of the two developments together is worth watching closely. Now let's talk about Iran's own stated position, because it has hardened rather than softened in the aftermath of the Jordan strikes. Iranian officials, through state media, described the American military's continued strikes as breaches of the previously agreed Memorandum of Understanding, with the country's current supreme leader stating that the United States would face what he called unforgettable lessons for what he characterized as repeated violations of the agreement, rhetoric that inverts the actual sequence of events this war has followed, since it was Iran's own attacks on commercial shipping that first broke the ceasefire framework established in June, not any unilateral American action taken in isolation. Iran has also separately stated that a significant part of its military capability remains unused, and that its response to continued American attacks could go beyond expectations and potentially open new fronts entirely, language that has been directly connected by observers of this war to a separate and genuinely striking Iranian statement, that Tehran is considering a ground campaign aimed at seizing American military bases in Kuwait, a claim serious enough to warrant careful examination on its own terms, rather than being folded into the general background noise of wartime rhetoric this conflict has produced in abundance since it began. It is also worth being clear about what remains unverified in Iran's own account of the Jordan strike itself. The IRGC's claim of completely destroying several American aircraft at the base has not been corroborated by CENTCOM, by Jordanian officials, or by any independent imagery released publicly as of this update, and it follows the same pattern of overstated Iranian damage claims that has characterized nearly every strike Tehran has claimed credit for throughout this entire war. That pattern of exaggeration does not diminish the reality of the 2 confirmed American deaths, which CENTCOM itself has acknowledged without qualification, but it does mean the full scope of physical damage inflicted on the base itself, beyond the tragic and confirmed loss of American life, remains considerably less certain than Iran's own public statements would suggest, and any assessment of the strike's true military effect should weight CENTCOM's more measured public accounting over the IRGC's considerably more expansive claims. That specific claim deserves careful, honest treatment rather than either dismissal or alarm. A ground assault on a sovereign Gulf state's territory, aimed at seizing facilities hosting American forces, would represent an escalation of a category this war has not yet seen, and it would require capabilities, air superiority over the objective area, chief among them, that Iran's forces do not currently appear to possess after 8 consecutive nights of American strikes against exactly the kind of air defense and coastal military infrastructure that would need to be intact to support any such operation. Whether that statement reflects genuine operational planning inside Iran's military leadership, or functions primarily as a rhetorical escalation aimed at demonstrating continued resolve to a domestic audience and to Washington simultaneously, is difficult to determine with confidence from outside Iran's own command structure. What can be said is that Iran has, throughout this war, shown a consistent pattern of pairing dramatic rhetorical threats with actual military capability that has, so far, fallen considerably short of matching that rhetoric in scale and effect. A pattern evident in earlier claims about unused strategic reserves and open new fronts that have, in each prior instance, failed to materialize into anything approaching the scale originally suggested. It is also worth placing that specific threat against the broader historical backdrop of what a genuine ground campaign against a well-defended American military installation would actually require. Modern American and partner nation bases in the Gulf are built around layered air defense, hardened perimeter security, and rapid response capability specifically designed to defeat exactly this kind of assault. And any force attempting to seize such a facility would need to first establish local air superiority, something Iran's Air Force has shown no capacity to contest against American and Allied aircraft at any point across this entire war, let alone specifically over contested Gulf airspace defended by both American forces and the host nation's own military. That does not mean such a threat should be dismissed outright as pure bluster. Miscalculation and desperation have driven military decisions throughout history that looked, from the outside, entirely irrational at the time they were made. But it does mean the specific, narrow military feasibility of the threat, as distinct from its rhetorical and political function, remains genuinely limited based on everything currently known about the state of Iran's remaining conventional forces. There is a further complication worth noting from the same general period. Iran launched additional ballistic missiles toward Jordan, and some of that debris, along with missiles that were intercepted, fell into Israeli territory. Israel has remained formally outside this war since it reignited, a notable restraint given Israel's role in the war's opening strikes back in February, when it acted alongside the United States in the initial operations that killed Iran's previous supreme leader and set this entire conflict in motion. Debris from Iranian missiles aimed at Jordan landing inside Israel, whether accidental given the geographic proximity of the two countries or a deliberate signal from Tehran, raises the stakes of every subsequent Iranian missile launch in that general direction because it establishes a precedent, however unintentional, of Iranian ordnance physically crossing into Israeli territory during this specific war, a development that could meaningfully shift the calculus in Jerusalem about how much longer to remain a bystander to a conflict fought largely, though clearly not entirely, within its own immediate neighborhood. Israel's continued restraint throughout this war has been one of its more consistent and, to many observers, surprising features. And it has generally been read as reflecting a calculation in Jerusalem that staying formally outside the fighting preserves flexibility and avoids becoming the explicit singular target of Iranian retaliation that a direct Israeli entry into the war would likely invite. Debris crossing into Israeli territory, even unintentionally, tests that calculation in a way that pure rhetoric from Tehran never quite has. Now let's talk about a parallel story that broke during this same general window, because it illustrates just how active every major conflict connected to this broader moment has become simultaneously, and because the underlying logic driving it mirrors, in important ways, the logic now driving the American campaign against Iran. Ukraine launched one of its largest long-range drone attacks of its entire war against Russia overnight into July 18th, striking 2 significant logistics facilities tied to Russia's drone production supply chain. Ukrainian forces hit a Wild Berries logistics center in Elektrostal, roughly 30 miles east of Moscow, and, by some accounts, the company's largest single facility by order processing volume, close enough that smoke from the resulting fire was visible from within Moscow's own city limits, along with a second Wild Berries facility in Kotovsk, in the Tambov region, and an oil depot in nearby Noginsk, where falling drone debris reportedly forced the evacuation of a maternity hospital and a nearby residential building. Casualty figures reported by Russian regional officials varied somewhat across the initial hours of coverage, generally ranging between 7 and 9 people killed, and figures for the wounded ranging from roughly 25 up toward 60 or more, depending on which regional governors count and which point in the unfolding story is being cited. Those numbers may continue to be revised as local authorities complete their assessment, a pattern of evolving, imprecise early casualty reporting that has now become a familiar feature of nearly every major strike covered across both of these overlapping wars this year, whether the strike in question happened in southern Iran